The verdict that shattered a family. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on every person seated on the polished wooden benches. Morning light filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting pale streaks across the chamber. Every face was turned toward the front, where the fate of one man stood suspended between hope and doom. "Will the defendant please rise?" The judge's voice was measured, but the words felt like iron bars slamming shut on Robert Hayes' future. Slowly, Robert stood, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table for support. The rust-colored jumpsuit seemed at odds with his military bearing, his spine still straight despite the chains on his wrists and ankles. His dark eyes, the same ones that had stared down death in distant deserts, now fixed on the jury box. Beside him, his daughter Evelyn Hayes rose too. The crisp navy suit she wore, her armor after years in courtrooms, couldn't hide the slight tremble in her hands. Her fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms, but her face was a mask of calm. The kind of calm that only comes after years of forcing composure, after a lifetime of fighting battles others don't see. The foreman stood, a man in his late 50s with thinning hair and thick glasses. He cleared his throat, the sound scraping the edges of the silence. "In the matter of the state versus Robert Hayes, we the jury find the defendant." The pause stretched too long. Evelyn's heart pounded so loud she couldn't hear the rest of the sentence. "Guilty of first-degree murder." The words didn't register at first. They couldn't. Not after 2 years of hearings, of evidence Evelyn had dismantled piece by piece. No murder weapon. No motive. No credible witnesses. Just smoke and shadows painted as proof. A gasp rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled to type. Cameras clicked in bursts, capturing the moment a war hero was declared a murderer. "No." Evelyn's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. She hadn't meant to speak, but the word clawed its way out of her throat. "No, you can't." Judge Malden's gavel cracked down once, twice. "Miss Hayes, control yourself." Evelyn stepped forward, ignoring the gavel. The murmurs, the sea of faces. "This verdict is wrong. There is no evidence tying my father to the scene. The state relied on coerced testimony and fabricated timelines. The real killer is still out there." The judge's eyes narrowed. "One more word and you'll be held in contempt." Evelyn's hands trembled, but she forced herself silent. Beside her, Robert reached out, his calloused hand covering hers. "Let it go, Evie," he whispered, his voice calm despite the noose tightening around his future. She couldn't. She wouldn't. "Robert Hayes," the judge's voice rang out, "for the crime of first-degree murder, I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection, to be carried out 30 days from today." It felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Somewhere, a reporter whispered, "Justice served." Someone clapped. Others cheered. The family of the victim, the local senator who had been gunned down in his office parking lot. Their faces twisted with righteous vengeance. Evelyn saw it all through a haze. Robert gave her hand one final squeeze before the guard stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs from the table and guiding him toward the side door. His chin remained lifted, his posture perfect even with the chains dragging at his ankles. Evelyn didn't cry. She didn't scream. She turned on her heel, walked past the reporters who thrust microphones at her, past the gawking faces of the public, through the courthouse doors, and into the blinding sunlight. Her life had just ended, but her war had only begun. The price of truth. The office of Whittaker and Crane, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state, was polished to perfection. The windows gleamed, the mahogany desks shone under soft lights, and the scent of fresh coffee floated through the air. It was the life Evelyn had built for herself. Prestigious, orderly, comfortable. And now, it was nothing. The moment she stepped into the partners' boardroom, the air turned heavy. James Whittaker, the founding partner, sat at the head of the table. His smile was practiced, but there was no warmth in it today. "Evelyn," he said, steepling his fingers. "We need to talk." She knew what was coming, but she sat anyway. The manila folder in front of him was thick, the words "Conflict of Interest Review" stamped across the top. "You're too close to this case," he began, his voice almost gentle. "The firm's reputation." "Save it," Evelyn cut him off. "If you're firing me, do it. If you're not, then either help me save my father or get out of my way." The room went silent. No one, not even the senior partners, had ever spoken to Whittaker like that. Linda Crane, the firm's PR manager, leaned forward, her red nails tapping the table. "Evelyn, the firm can't be tied to a convicted murderer's appeal. It's bad optics." Evelyn stood. "Then I quit." The words echoed in the room. They all expected her to back down, to compromise, to protect her career. Instead, she slid her ID badge onto the table, its metallic clink a death knell to her old life. "You're throwing everything away," James said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "No," Evelyn said, her spine as straight as her father's had been in court. "I'm finally fighting for something that matters." She walked out, leaving behind the salary, the status, the carefully curated career. All she had now was the truth, and a 30-day deadline. The chains we choose. That night, Evelyn stood outside the Supreme Court building. The marble steps stretched before her, gleaming under the streetlights. The building had always seemed imposing, but tonight it felt like the last fortress standing between her father and death. In her hands, she held a length of heavy chain. Her heart pounded in her ears, but her hands were steadied as she looped the metal around the pillar nearest the entrance. The first link clinked softly, the second louder. By the time she wrapped the chain around her own waist and snapped the lock, the sound echoed in the empty street. Somewhere, a security guard shouted. Lights inside the building flickered to life. She stood her ground. "I'm not moving," Evelyn called out, her voice strong despite the tightness in her chest. "Not until someone listens." The first cameras arrived within minutes. By morning, the story would explode across the country. Some would call her brave. Others would call her reckless. She didn't care. Let them call her whatever they wanted. Her father was innocent, and she would chain herself to the gates of power until the world knew it too. The weight of the world. The rain started before dawn, cold and unrelenting. It soaked her suit, plastered her hair to her face, made her hands numb where they gripped the chain. Reporters gathered, their umbrellas forming a patchwork sea of colors. Some shouted questions. Others just stared, waiting for her to break. She didn't. Evelyn stood, her feet planted on the marble, her body drenched, her voice steady when she spoke to the cameras. "My father is innocent. I will not move until someone opens his case." The chain dug into her waist, heavy and unyielding. Just like the system she was fighting. Just like the fight she would not lose. The storm Evelyn called down. The rain had soaked through her clothes long before the sun came up. Evelyn stood chained to the white marble pillar of the Supreme Court, her fingers numb from gripping the cold metal, her feet aching from standing in damp heels on slick stone. Her soaked blazer hung heavy off her shoulders, rainwater tracing rivulets down her back. She should have been exhausted, but the ache in her chest, the place where panic and fury had made a home, burned hotter than ever. The world was awake now, and it was watching. Camera crews huddled under plastic tarps across the street, lenses aimed at her like sniper scopes. Curious onlookers, tourists, and local activists gathered at the bottom of the steps, whispering to one another and snapping photos on their phones. Overnight, the spectacle had grown from a lone woman in chains to the first spark of something much larger. Somewhere inside the courthouse, judges, clerks, and lawyers would be sipping coffee, shaking their heads, and calling her crazy. She didn't care. The law had already failed her father. If the system refused to listen, then the world would. Evelyn shifted, the chain biting into her waist, the cold metal digging against her hip bone. She winced but forced herself still as the first morning reporter climbed the steps. Evelyn Hayes, the woman called, her umbrella bobbing as she tried to hold it and her microphone at the same time. "You've been out here all night. Are you prepared to stay indefinitely?" Evelyn lifted her chin, water dripping from her eyelashes. "I'll stay as long as it takes to save my father's life." The reporter hesitated, her question hanging in the air. But before she could follow up, a new voice broke through the morning haze. "This isn't how we fix injustice." Evelyn's stomach twisted at the familiar voice. She turned, heart sinking, to see her younger brother, Mark Hayes, standing at the bottom of the steps. He was out of place in his scrubs, a disposable coffee cup in one hand and dark circles beneath his eyes. The camera crews swiveled to capture the siblings' standoff, a perfect media moment. "Mark," Evelyn said, her voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing here? You think chaining yourself to a building changes anything?" He said, his voice raised enough for the crowd to hear. "This isn't how we fix it. You're humiliating yourself." Evelyn's jaw clenched. "They sentenced our father to death, Mark, for something he didn't do. There are legal channels," Mark shouted, exasperation bleeding into anger. "This circus isn't going to save him." "The legal channels failed," Evelyn shot back, her voice sharper than she meant. "You saw it happen. You sat in the courtroom just like I did." Mark took a step closer, eyes blazing. "I saw you throw your entire life away for this. I saw you alienate your friends, your firm, your future. And for what? To be a hashtag for a week." The words hit like fists. Evelyn's face remained calm, but inside, the wound reopened. The guilt, the grief, all the pieces she'd held together with spit and stubbornness threatened to split wide open. She forced herself to focus on the cameras. They were still rolling. That was what mattered. "If being a hashtag gets someone to re-examine my father's case," she said, her voice trembling only slightly, "then I'll take it." Mark shook his head, but the argument was over. He turned on his heel and walked away, the cameras following him until he disappeared down the rain-slick sidewalk. Evelyn's throat burned, but she wouldn't let the tears fall. She had no time for grief. Not now, when every minute mattered. Behind the curtain. By mid-morning, the protest had evolved into a national event. Social media boiled with takes, some calling Evelyn a hero, others branding her a reckless embarrassment to the legal profession. But the real firestorm was unfolding far from the cameras, in a series of conference rooms and private calls Evelyn would never be invited to. In a sleek downtown office, Senator Harold Mathers sat at the head of a mahogany table, his expression dark as rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Across from him, District Attorney Colin Rothwell leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "She's become a problem," Mathers said flatly. "A big one." "She's got proof," Rothwell said, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "The appeal records she filed. They're airtight. If anyone outside the courthouse actually reads them, we're screwed." "We control the courts," Mathers snapped. "What we don't control is public opinion." "She's winning that battle," Rothwell admitted. There was silence, save for the hum of the rain. Then Mathers leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Then we make sure this stays a spectacle," the senator said, his voice cold. "We discredit her, we bury her, and if she doesn't walk away, we make sure she doesn't walk at all." Day 2. Threats begin. The second night was colder. Evelyn had managed a thermos of coffee, passed to her by a supporter between reporters' questions. Her fingers were stiff from gripping the chains, her knees sore from standing so long. But the crowd had grown. College students with signs, veterans who'd served alongside her father, mothers with children on their hips, and even a handful of former clients she defended over the years. They stood in the rain, chanting, holding signs with her father's name. Hashtag Free Robert Hayes. Hashtag Justice for the Innocent. Hashtag The System is Broken. Their voices gave her strength, but the first sign that things were about to shift came just before midnight. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a private number. She almost ignored it, but instinct made her swipe to answer. "Miss Hayes," said a voice, so distorted by software it barely sounded human. "You've made your point. Now go home." Evelyn's heart pounded. Who is this? "Go home, Evelyn, or your father won't be the only body in a casket." The line went dead. She stood there for a moment, the cold pressing in from all sides. Then, slowly, she lowered the phone. The cameras were still rolling, so she turned to face them, her face calm even as her stomach twisted in fear. "I received my first threat tonight," she said, her voice clear, carrying over the rain. "That only proves I'm right. I won't be leaving. Not until justice is served." The crowd erupted in cheers, but somewhere in the shadows, Evelyn knew someone was watching. Someone who wasn't cheering at all. The target on her back. By the morning of day 3, the threats were no longer subtle. Her car tires had been slashed. Anonymous emails filled her inbox with graphic threats. Reporters began asking if she feared for her safety. She answered the same way every time. "My father's life is worth any risk." But her hands shook when the cameras weren't looking. The legal appeals she'd filed were stuck, held in endless administrative delays. Phone calls met with silence or polite refusals. The judge who had sentenced her father refused to reconsider his ruling. Governor Rowan's office issued a carefully worded statement about respecting due process. The system had closed ranks. If Evelyn wanted to save her father, she would have to break it wide open. That afternoon, she made her boldest move yet. On live television, she removed the chain from her waist, stepped to the center of the steps, and looked directly into the primary news camera. "I'm calling for a federal investigation into the wrongful conviction of Robert Hayes," she announced, her voice clear as a bell. "The corruption in this case stretches from local law enforcement to the highest levels of the judicial system. If you believe in justice, I need you to stand with me." Within an hour, #Investigate Robert Hayes was trending. The storm Evelyn had called down had finally arrived. And she would either ride it to victory or be crushed beneath its weight. Breaking chains, shattering silence. Evelyn hadn't expected sleep. She hadn't even expected quiet. But the pounding on her door at 4:17 a.m. was the kind of sound that sliced through exhaustion and adrenaline alike. The knock wasn't frantic, but deliberate, sharp, spaced, and with the kind of weight only law enforcement carried. She opened the door still wearing the same clothes she'd worn for nearly 48 hours. The chain at her waist had left a faint, bruised line across her hips, and her eyes were rimmed red from rain, exhaustion, and the harsh glare of television lights. 2 men stood at her door, plain clothes, but they might as well have been wearing neon signs that said FBI. Miss Hayes, the taller of the two, a man with a shaved head and a hawk-like nose, spoke with the clipped tone of someone who wasn't here for pleasantries. "We need to talk." "About?" she asked, voice hoarse but defiant. "We received credible information regarding threats made against you." He held up a slim manila folder, as if it contained the weight of the world. "You're in danger." Evelyn's smile was humorless. "You think I don't know that?" "Miss Hayes." "Let me guess," she interrupted, leaning her weight against the doorframe. "You're not here to protect me. You're here to convince me to stop." The shorter agent, younger, with the earnest face of someone still clinging to ideals, shifted uncomfortably. "We're not saying you have to stop, but you'd prefer it." Evelyn's voice was quiet, but each word cut clean. "You want me to pack up my chains, stop asking questions, and go play the grieving daughter while my father dies. That about right?" "Miss Hayes," the taller agent said again, this time with less patience. "You've attracted attention from some dangerous people. People who don't like the attention you're drawing to this case." "Good." She crossed her arms. "That means they're scared." The younger agent tried again. "There are limits, Miss Hayes. You're putting yourself in unnecessary risk. No cause is worth your life." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "My father's life is. And I'm not the one you should be warning." She shut the door before they could respond, her heart pounding harder than before. They were scared, not for her, but for what she might uncover. That meant there was something worth hiding. She needed to find it. Whispers in the walls. The Supreme Court steps were emptier the next morning. The rain had driven away the casual gawkers, leaving only the most determined. A cluster of college students, a handful of veterans, and a growing assembly of independent journalists smelling a scandal. Evelyn stood at the top, the morning breeze tugging at the loose strands of her hair. The chain was still there, draped around the pillar like a silent promise. Cameras clicked as she stepped up to the microphone stand someone had set up overnight. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," she said, her voice steadier than her legs felt. "My father, Robert Hayes, is an innocent man scheduled to die in less than 30 days. She paused, the silence filled only by the faint sound of distant traffic. "I am not asking for mercy," she continued. "I am demanding justice. There is evidence of witness tampering, fabricated timelines, and deliberate suppression of key evidence. If this system refuses to reopen his case, it is no longer a justice system. It is a death machine." The crowd applauded, but it was the silence from the building behind her that mattered most. "I will not move until someone listens," Evelyn said, gripping the podium. "I will stand here until someone remembers that justice is supposed to mean something." A hand tugged at her sleeve. She turned to find Darnell Shaw, her father's oldest friend, and a former cop turned private investigator. His face was hard, lined with years of disappointment and too many nights spent staring at files no one wanted opened. "Need to talk," he muttered, low enough that the cameras didn't catch it. She followed him down the steps, away from the cameras, to the far side of the plaza where the rain pooled in uneven stone cracks. "Got a call last night," Darnell said. Anonymous. Voice distorted. Evelyn's stomach clenched. "Another threat." "No," Darnell said, and the way his mouth twisted made her heart skip a beat. "This was someone who wanted me to find something." He handed her a flash drive, its plastic surface damp from his grip. "Where did it come from?" "Courier dropped it at my office. No return address. Just said it was for you." Evelyn turned the drive over in her hand. "What's on it?" "No idea," Darnell admitted. "But if someone's risking this much to get it to you, it's big." Buried truths. The borrowed laptop hummed quietly in Evelyn's hotel room. She'd left her apartment 2 nights ago, when she found her front door ajar. Nothing taken, nothing touched, but the unmistakable scent of warning left behind. She inserted the flash drive, her fingers trembling only slightly. A single folder appeared. Hotcake ESCASE, EVIDENC Superioricate. Her breath caught. Her father's case file. She clicked it open. There were photos she'd never seen. Grainy surveillance stills showing a shadowy figure near the senator's car. The timestamp placed the figure at the scene after her father's arrest. There were audio files too, recordings of interrogations where witnesses were clearly coached, their words clipped and hesitant under pressure. The last file was a memo, marked CONFIDENTIL, from D.A. Colin Rothwell's office. It outlined the strategy to pin the murder on Robert Hayes, citing his military history, his race, and his previous dispute with the senator over veteran housing funding. Her hand shook so hard she almost dropped the laptop. It wasn't just sloppy work or bias. This was deliberate. They hadn't just ignored evidence. They'd built the case to fit Robert because he was convenient. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop now or you'll join him on the table." Evelyn closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Then she sent the files to every journalist she knew. And a few she didn't. Let them come. The first strike. The smear campaign started before sunrise. Headlines labeled her unstable daughter of convicted killer. Former colleagues gave interviews about her obsessive tendencies. Anonymous sources described her erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to her protest. It was textbook. Attack the messenger to bury the message. It would have worked, if not for the flash drive. The recordings and photos spread like wildfire. Social media latched onto the corruption. Outraged veterans groups mobilized, and civil rights activists demanded answers. The governor's office went silent. The DA's office shut its doors to reporters. And Evelyn? She was still on the steps, chained, waiting. The cost of defiance. 2 nights later, her phone rang at 2:00 a.m. She almost ignored it, but the number was familiar. "Mark," she said, her voice hoarse. "Evelyn." His voice was tight, controlled. "You need to stop." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Mark, they threatened Mom," he said quietly. "She's terrified." Evelyn's breath caught in her chest. "They what?" "She's getting calls. Letters. They left something dead on the porch." His voice cracked. "I can't protect her if you keep this up." Evelyn pressed a hand to her forehead. The walls were closing in. They were trying to break her, and they were using the people she loved to do it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Just think about it," Mark said, "before there's nothing left to save." The call ended, leaving her in silence. Tears burned her eyes, but she didn't cry. There was no time. She curled up in the hotel bed, her father's face behind her eyelids, and whispered the same thing she'd whispered every night since the verdict. "Hold on, Dad. I'm coming." The cost of unraveling the truth. Evelyn sat in the dim glow of her hotel room, the weight of exhaustion pressing her shoulders down like cinder blocks. Her fingers hovered over her laptop keyboard, the blinking cursor taunting her with all the unfinished work still in front of her. Every document, every recording, every snippet of evidence that had landed in her lap was a new cut in her already bleeding faith in the justice system. The flash drive Darnell had given her was still plugged into the side of her laptop, glowing faintly. It was her lifeline, and her noose. Every file she opened was more damning than the last. Redacted memos from the district attorney's office, lists of preferred witnesses, payments made to informants who had never even been near the crime scene. They had built the case against her father before they had even found the body. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She didn't want to look. Every call, every text felt like a fresh threat, a new warning. But when she saw the name, her stomach clenched. Mark. She let it ring once, twice. On the third, she answered. Evelyn. Mark's voice was lower than usual, rough, like he hadn't slept. "We need to talk." She closed her laptop. "If you're calling to tell me to stop again, say your breath." A long pause stretched between them. The silence filled with everything unsaid between them. "Mom's leaving town," Mark finally said. "They slashed her tires last night, left a bullet in the mailbox." Evelyn's stomach turned over, bile rising in her throat. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "She's terrified, Evie. She blames you." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. "They're doing this to her because they know they can't scare me." "Maybe they can't scare you," Mark said bitterly. "But you didn't see her this morning, packing a bag with shaking hands, asking if I thought they'd come inside the house next time." Evelyn's throat tightened. Where is she going? Staying with Aunt Linda upstate, far away from this mess. Mark's voice softened slightly. "You're playing with fire, Evelyn. You always have." "This isn't a game," she said quietly. "This is Dad's life." "Yeah," Mark said. "And maybe ours too." The call ended, leaving her alone with her guilt. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the window. Rain streaking the glass, neon lights from the street below painting her face in fractured red and blue. The man in the shadow. At 2:36 a.m., there was a knock at the hotel door. Not the hard, aggressive pound of police or the frantic tapping of a courier. This knock was precise. 3 soft raps, evenly spaced, like a coded message. Evelyn's hand hovered near her phone as she crossed the room. Through the peephole, she saw only a shadow, someone deliberately standing just out of view. She cracked the door. "Who are you?" The man stepped into the light, and Evelyn's stomach dropped. Ethan Crane, her former colleague, Her former friend. The one person who had tried to warn her before everything fell apart. "Let me in," Ethan said, his eyes darting down the hall. "We need to talk." Evelyn hesitated for only a second before stepping aside. Ethan slipped in, Rain still clinging to his coat, and stood just inside the door, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "You shouldn't be here either," he shot back. "But you're not exactly listening to anyone lately." She crossed her arms. "If you came to scold me, save it. I came to warn you." Ethan peeled off his wet coat, tossing it onto the chair. "There's a target on your back, Evelyn. A big one. And it's not just your back anymore." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Ethan's face was grim. "They're not just going after you. They're going after anyone who helps you. Darnell's already been tailed twice. One of your old clients had their house raided yesterday. Under some bullshit pretense. They want to isolate you." Evelyn's hand shook, but she clenched them into fists to hide it. "Let them come." "They will," Ethan said. "And when they do, they'll come hard." She sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of it all crashing down. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan's smile was humorless. "Because I remember who you used to be. Before you joined Whittaker and Crane. Before you started defending hedge fund scumbags and lobbying groups." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I remember too." Ethan's voice softened. "You're fighting for something real again, Evie. That scares the hell out of them." Evelyn's phone buzzed again. A blocked number. She didn't answer. The setup. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at her father's prison with the paperwork for an emergency review of his case. The clerk at the front desk, a tired woman in her 50s with graying hair and smudged eyeliner, took one look at the papers and shook her head. "Can't accept these," she said. Evelyn's heart skipped. "What? Why not?" The clerk slid a thin sheet of paper across the counter. "Effective immediately. Attorney Evelyn Hayes is barred from representing Robert Hayes in any legal capacity. All filings submitted by Miss Hayes will be rejected." "They can't do this," Evelyn whispered. The clerk shrugged. "They just did." Evelyn's hands shook as she snatched up the paper. "Who ordered this?" The clerk's eyes darted left, then right. "Ask Judge Greaves," she whispered. "He's the one who signed off." Evelyn's vision blurred with rage. Graves, the same judge who'd ignored evidence, who had refused to consider the appeal. The man was a cog in the machine that wanted her father dead. The meeting. Evelyn didn't bother with an appointment. She stormed into Greaves' chambers, ignoring the receptionist's frantic protests. The judge sat behind his oak desk, looking up with mild annoyance. "Miss Hayes," he said, as if her presence were a minor inconvenience, "this is highly inappropriate. Denying my right to represent my own father is inappropriate." She shot back, slamming the rejection notice on his desk. Greaves didn't even flinch. "Your behavior has made you unsuitable as counsel." "My behavior," she hissed, "or the fact that I exposed your corruption." His smile was thin. "Tread carefully, Miss Hayes." Evelyn leaned in, her palms flat on the desk. "No, you tread carefully. I have every memo, every redacted file, every conversation you thought was buried. And I have the public's attention." Greaves' smile faded. "That attention won't save you." "Maybe not," she said, "but it will bury you." She turned and walked out before she could see his reaction. Every step away from his office felt like another declaration of war. The last betrayal. She was halfway back to her hotel when her phone rang. This time, it wasn't a blocked number. It was Darnell. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Evelyn." His voice was tight. "They found me." Her stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "They broke into my office. Took my files, my computers, everything." His voice cracked. "I think they planted something too." "Planted what?" "Drugs, Evelyn. They're setting me up." The line crackled. "I need to lay low. I can't help you anymore." Evelyn's throat went dry. "Darnell, I'm sorry," he said, "but they're not just after you. They're after anyone who stands with you." The line went dead. Evelyn sat in her car, parked on a side street, the rain blurring the world outside. Piece by piece, they were tearing her life apart. But they had underestimated her. She had nothing left to lose, except her father, and they were going to learn just how dangerous a woman with nothing left could be. A daughter's war. The hotel room felt smaller than it had the night before. The walls seemed to press inward, their edges smudging into shadow. The ceiling lower than Evelyn remembered. Sleep hadn't found her. Not even after her confrontation with Judge Greaves. Not after Darnell's call. Not after hours spent staring at her father's face in the one framed photo she had brought with her. Her father, younger and smiling, holding her on his shoulders outside their crumbling rental house. His smile was real then, before the war, before the years spent working 2 jobs to put her through school, before the state decided his life was disposable. Her hands trembled as she stuffed files into her worn leather satchel, fingers curling around the damning pieces of evidence she'd collected. Documents that could exonerate him, if anyone in power cared enough to read them. But they didn't care. That was the truth Evelyn had been choking on since the trial. It wasn't about evidence or guilt or justice. It was about control. About making an example out of a man who had the audacity to stand up to power and demand something better for men like him, for veterans like him, for black men like him. Now, the machine that had framed him was coming for her too. Her phone buzzed, a text flashing from an unknown number. "We gave you a chance. Time's up." She stared at the screen until it dimmed, then powered the phone off and tossed it into her satchel. Let them come. The lawyer with no courtroom. The marble steps of the Supreme Court were slick with last night's rain. Evelyn stood at the top, her navy suit wrinkled, her heels scuffed from 2 days of pacing. Her hair was still damp, plastered to the side of her face, but it didn't matter. She wasn't here to impress anyone. A handful of supporters were still there, huddled together under umbrellas, signs drooping in the drizzle. Most of the news vans were gone. Their producers no doubt convinced her story had hit a plateau. Just another protester screaming into the void. But Evelyn wasn't screaming. She was here to burn the whole system down. She chained herself to the pillar again, the metal links clinking in the silence. Cameras clicked, someone live-streamed, and within minutes her face was on phones and tablets across the country once more. This time, she didn't give a speech. This time, she held up a single sheet of paper. The sealed memo from the district attorney's office, the one laying out how to fabricate a case against Robert Hayes. The chain around her waist creaked as she raised the paper higher. "This," she said, her voice raw, "is what justice looks like in America." She held the paper in front of the camera lenses, letting the world read the damning words for themselves, the language of framing, coercion, and narrative control. Her father's fate, written in the cold ink of strategy memos. The crowd grew, people emerging from office buildings, gathering on the steps. Some cheered. Some stood in stunned silence. Somewhere inside the courthouse, Evelyn knew they were watching too. The discredit campaign. The first smear piece hit within an hour. Unstable daughter resorts to stunts as legal career crumbles. They found her law school records, that one semester where she'd taken a leave of absence to care for her mother after the cancer diagnosis. They painted it as a mental health crisis, a red flag they'd conveniently ignored until now. They found an old client, a man whose assault charges she'd fought to have dismissed after evidence was mishandled, and quoted him saying she was unhinged and obsessive. They plastered her face next to headlines that screamed radical activist and dangerous extremist. It didn't matter. She'd expected all of it. What she didn't expect was the footage. Somehow, whether from a corrupt guard or a hidden camera, they got footage of her father in his cell. Prisoner 11,745. Robert Hayes, sitting on the edge of his cot, his hands shaking as he held a small photo of her. He was talking to himself, his voice too low to hear, but his shoulders shook with silent sobs. They ran the footage everywhere. Is this the man you're defending? Evelyn's heart cracked wide open in front of the whole world. Betrayal in the blood. She was halfway up the courthouse steps when her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a name she hadn't expected. Mark. She answered, her breath still catching in her chest. Mark. You have to stop. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying. Evelyn, please. She braced against the cold marble pillar, rainwater seeping into the fabric of her blazer. I can't. They came to my clinic, Mark said, his voice breaking. They said if you don't stop, they'll shut it down. They're going after my patients, Evelyn. Sick kids. Veterans. They're using them. Evelyn's stomach twisted. I'm sorry. You keep saying that, but you're not. Mark's voice sharpened. You're addicted to this fight. You're so obsessed with saving Dad, you're burning down everyone around you. That's not true. Isn't it? He shot back. You lost your job. You lost your friends. Now you're losing your family. And for what? For the truth, she whispered. Mark was silent for a long moment. Then you're on your own, he said. I can't do this anymore. The line went dead. Evelyn stared at the phone, her heart breaking all over again. But the chain at her waist held firm. A visitor in the dark. That night, Evelyn sat in the dark of her hotel room. The evidence files spread around her like puzzle pieces. She knew the system was watching. Her phone was tapped. Her room probably bugged. It didn't matter anymore. There was a soft knock at the door. She froze, her mind racing. It was too late for housekeeping. Too late for reporters. When she opened it, a man stood there, tall, gray-haired, with the weary posture of someone who had spent his life balancing on the edge of power. Senator Alan Greaves. May I come in? He asked, voice polite but brittle. Evelyn stepped aside, every muscle coiled. Greaves sat at the small table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. You've made quite the mess, he said. You made the mess, Evelyn shot back. I'm just shining a light on it. He smiled faintly. You're a fighter. I respect that. You framed my father, Evelyn said, her voice low but shaking with rage. You stole his life to cover your corruption. Greaves tilted his head. Your father was collateral damage. You know how this works. No, she said, but I'm learning. He slid a file across the table. There's a deal on the table. She didn't touch it. I'm not making deals. It's not for you, Greaves said, his smile thin. It's for your father. Her heart stuttered. Confess, Greaves said. Say you fabricated evidence, lied to the press, ruin your own credibility. We'll commute his sentence to life. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Admit you lied, Greaves said softly, or they inject him in 5 days. Her hand shook as she pushed the file back. No. Greaves stood, straightening his tie. You're not the only one with nothing left to lose, Miss Hayes. He left without another word. The room was silent except for the rain tapping against the window. She sank into the chair, her fists clenched, her mind racing. Destroy herself or lose her father. It wasn't a choice. It was war, a fire that would not die. Evelyn sat alone in the hotel room, the fluorescent hum of the bedside lamp the only sound to cut through the silence. The file Senator Greaves had left sat on the table, unopened. It felt like poison. Something you didn't need to taste to know it would kill you. Her reflection stared back at her in the window. Her face was sharper now, her skin pale, her dark hair hanging limp over her shoulders. This was who she'd become. A woman worn to the bone, stripped down to her last nerve, held together only by the single belief that her father's life mattered. 5 days. That was all the time they'd given her. If she gave up now, if she stood in front of the cameras and confessed to fabricating evidence, they'd commute her father's death sentence to life in prison. Life, a euphemism for dying slowly behind walls no one would ever see. A death sentence in all but name. Or she could keep fighting, knowing the machine would crush her, knowing they would silence her before the truth could ever fully escape. She pressed her fingers into her temples, shutting her eyes. The choice was no choice at all. I will not let them bury him. Her fingers curled into fists. The last call. At 5:17 a.m., her phone rang. She expected another threat, another reminder that she was on borrowed time. But it was Mark. She hesitated before answering, guilt flickering through her like static electricity. Mark, I need to see you. His voice was low, urgent. Please. No cameras. Just us. Evelyn closed her eyes. Where? Dad's old VFO hall, Mark said. Half an hour. The line went dead. The parking lot outside the VFW was empty except for Mark's car, his old sedan, still bearing the scuffed bumper from that accident in college he never quite got around to fixing. Evelyn's heels crunched against the gravel as she approached the door, the cold morning air biting at her skin. Inside, the hall was dark, lit only by the pale spill of light from the windows. Mark stood by the bar, nursing a cup of black coffee. His shoulders were hunched, his expression guarded. You wanted to see me. Evelyn's voice was careful. Mark turned, his face a map of sleepless nights. You're out of options. Evelyn crossed her arms. That's never stopped me before. Maybe it should, Mark said. This isn't just about you or Dad anymore. It's about Mom. It's about me. You're dragging us all into a war you can't win. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I'm not the one dragging you in. They are. Mark's hands shook slightly as he set his coffee down. I'm begging you, Evelyn. Take the deal. Admit you lied. They'll spare him. They'll bury him alive. Evelyn's voice cracked. And they'll bury the truth with him. At least he'll be alive, Mark shouted, his voice echoing off the empty walls. Do you think he wants to die for your crusade? You think being right is worth losing him? Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. You think I haven't thought about that every second of every day? Then prove it. Mark's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Save him. Evelyn's fists curled so tightly her nails bit into her palms. I can't save him by destroying the truth. Mark's voice dropped, low and broken. Then you're not saving him at all. Lighting the fuse. Evelyn stood on the Supreme Court steps at noon, the crowd larger than it had ever been. Hundreds filled the plaza. Students, veterans, civil rights leaders, even mothers with strollers, their children clutching signs too big for their small hands. The chain was gone. She no longer needed it. A podium stood at the top of the steps, cameras surrounding it. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. The entire country was watching. Evelyn stood before the microphone, her hands trembling only slightly. I was offered a deal, she began, her voice steady. If I stood here today and confessed to fabricating evidence, they promised they'd commute my father's death sentence. A murmur swept through the crowd. The reporters leaned in. But I won't lie, Evelyn said, her voice rising. I won't tell you my father is guilty to save him from their needle. The truth matters. It matters for my father. It matters for every innocent man and woman they've thrown into prison because it was convenient. The crowd erupted in cheers. My father is innocent, she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. And if telling the truth costs me my reputation, my career, or even my life, so be it. The applause was thunderous. But somewhere in the back of the crowd, Evelyn saw the dark suits. The men who weren't clapping. The men who were already planning how to silence her for good. The final betrayal. That night, Evelyn sat cross-legged on her hotel bed, sorting through papers, her father's old letters scattered across the comforter. Each word was a reminder of the life he'd led before they'd reduced him to a case number. The knock at the door was soft. Too soft. Her pulse quickened. She crossed the room, peering through the peephole. Nothing. But when she opened the door, A manila envelope lay on the floor, its edges damp from the rain. She picked it up, heart hammering in her chest. Inside were two things, a single Polaroid and a folded note. The Polaroid showed Mark, his face bruised, his hands zip-tied behind his back, his mouth gagged. He was kneeling on a concrete floor. The note read, "You didn't listen. Now he pays." Evelyn's knees buckled. She sank against the door, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. They had her brother. The bargain. The phone rang. Blocked number. Evelyn answered, her voice shaking. "Where is he?" A calm, male voice spoke. "You want him back. You know what to do." Evelyn clutched the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. "If you hurt him, confess," the voice interrupted. "Say you fabricated everything. Go public. Renounce the evidence. You have 6 hours." The line went dead. Evelyn sat on the floor, shaking, the Polaroid clutched in her hands. They had her father's life in one hand, her brother's in the other. The reckoning. At dawn, Evelyn stood before a row of microphones outside the courthouse. Her hair was unbrushed, her makeup smudged, but her eyes were clear. The cameras rolled. The world watched. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," she said, "and everything I told you about my father's case is true." There were gasps from the press. "They've tried to silence me," she said. "They've threatened my family. They've taken my brother hostage." Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. "I will not be silent," she said, her voice breaking. "And if they kill my father to protect their lies, the whole world will know exactly who they are." The crowd roared. Behind her, a line of lawyers and civil rights leaders stepped up, standing with her. Veterans in full dress stood beside them, saluting. The machine had come for her, and she built an army. Epilogue. 1 year later. The new trial took 6 months. It ended with the court overturning Robert Hayes' conviction. He walked out of prison a free man, his daughter's hand in his, both of them scared but standing. The senator and the district attorney resigned in disgrace, their backroom deals laid bare in public hearings. Investigations rippled through the justice system, exposing more false convictions, more ruined lives. Evelyn never went back to corporate law. Instead, she founded the Hayes Project, a legal advocacy group for wrongfully convicted prisoners. She stood beside men and women society had tried to forget, their chains no longer invisible. She was no longer a lawyer. She was a warrior, and she never looked back.